The Constitution has also been reinterpreted to suit the NDR, and I can't give many examples of this, but perhaps just look at one in particular, and that is non-racialism. It's identified as a founding value of the new order, and yet constantly it is betrayed by racial quotas in employment, procurement, equity ownership, and elsewhere. And employment equity, or EE and BEE, are nevertheless bait and switch policies, to cite Thomas Sowell. What he says is they use the plight of the poor to implement policies that then benefit the relative elite. And that is true in America, and it is certainly true in South Africa, where perhaps 15% of black South Africans have benefited from these policies, and the remaining 85% have not benefited. Worse still, they've very often been harmed, because the appointment of unskilled people, the way in which preferential procurement works, means that state resources are not well used, and the poor people that rely on the state are shortchanged all the time. In addition, EE and BEE contradict another clause in the Constitution. This is Section 195, which requires broad representativity in the public service. Well, the first thing is that broad representativity is very different from the very rigid arithmetical quotas that are expected to be upheld. And whereas Section 95 talks also about the need for fairness and objectivity and ability and efficiency, all of those other factors are also forgotten. But critically, Section 195 talks only about broad representativity in the public service. So it doesn't apply in SOEs such as Eskom, which has been so diligent in trying to push out many of the experienced engineers in its employ because of racial quota imperatives. And it certainly doesn't apply in the private sector, something which the government is not willing to acknowledge when it passes a law such as the Employment Equity Amendment Act. Then there's another section in the Constitution which deals with procurement, and that's being effectively flouted as well, because Section 217 of the Constitution says that all organs of state must always procure goods and services in a way that is cost-effective, efficient, competitive, that, as Zondo put it, provides value for money. And that's an absolute obligation. But then the section also goes on to state that this does not prevent organs of state from applying preferences if these will advance the disadvantaged. But that wording is not mandatory, it's permissive at best. And yet the government is interpreting it as if all organs of state were obliged to implement these preferences. It's certainly not true for the private sector. And yet again, we see BEE requirements constantly disregarding this. Excuse me. And with the help of this sort of informally amended constitution, we have many NDR achievements in the socio-economic arena as well. And I'd like to look at some of the ones that were introduced under Zuma, who we all have been taught to believe is our radical economic transformation leader. And under him there was, for example, an amendment to labour law that introduced major constraints on casual and temporary labour. And many employers had found it preferable to employ people on a temporary basis, because if you employed them on a permanent basis, they were subject to such strict rules on salaries, benefits, retrenchments, terminations, and so on. And so casual employment was really the only part of the labour market that was growing strongly. Cosatu claimed that this was entirely illegitimate and that people being employed by labour brokers were effectively being used as slave labour, and the law was passed, which does not completely prohibit casual labour, but it does constrain it effectively to a period of 3 months. So the effect was to choke off an important avenue for first-time work seekers to get their foot on the ladder, the jobs ladder, and secondly, to just make it more difficult to generate the jobs that we so badly need. Then BEE rules were tightened up, particularly, say, in the preferential procurement area, and there were harsher penalties. And a new offence of fronting was introduced, which was very broadly defined, and now directors could be sent to jail for up to 10 years for fronting. and if the company was involved, then there could be a fine of up to 10% of annual turnover, also for the offence of fronting as very broadly defined. But 10% of annual turnover is an extraordinary amount. Many businesses don't make a profit of that amount, of that proportion. So they are being set up to be pushed into bankruptcy for failure to do what the government wants on BEE. Employment equity rules are also tightened up. There were fewer defences available to business on which they could rely, and again bigger fines, with the possibility at the end of the day for repeat offences that a firm might be fined 10% of annual turnover for failing to make reasonable progress towards demographic representativity when the skills shortage, among other things, makes that so difficult to attain. And the entire idea of a norm of demographic representativity is not accurate. It's not found in any society, despite great efforts to locate it.